It's really great to be here today, and especially to meet people that I've never met before in my life, to see old friends, and to find out that there were people here from Bridge City and Orange, where I grew up, and even a couple from Massachusetts, and my next door neighbor who has only seen me come in the dark of night when I would be working for the city and wondered what I did during the day. Why were all those boxes in my house? Now that you've met my step-grandmother through the video, I would like to introduce you before I get into my presentation to the rest of my family. Starting at the top, there are the Henry Jacob Letcher and Frances Ann Letcher. Those are my great-great-grandparents. They moved to Louisiana and Texas in 1877 from Pennsylvania. And luckily for them, moving into a southern state area right after the Civil War, both their daughters married into prominent Confederate families. Miriam Letcher Stark, my great-grandmother on the bottom left, and William H. Stark, or known as W.H. Stark in Orange. W.H. Stark was the son of John Thomas Stark. Actually, he was one of 18 children of John Thomas Stark. But luckily, John Thomas Stark had 3 wives. And, and John Thomas Stark was a captain and was the commander of the Hood's Texas Brigade at one point. So he was rather well known in Orange. In the next slide, at the top is Carrie Letcher Brown, her sister, Miriam's sister, and she married Dr. Edgar Brown, who was the son of Samuel Brown, who was a physician who traveled quite a bit with Robert E. Lee. So they were well connected immediately, so they kind of had a smooth transition into the Southern way of life. And at the bottom, that is a picture of Carrie Letcher Brown with her son, one of her sons, Edgar, and his wife Gladys, when they christened a tug in honor of her husband. And Dr. Edgar Brown died, I believe, in the 1920s. He died at a fairly young age. And these were just some pictures in Orange. These are in your book if you have a copy of the book. But I wanted to show you these, and especially if you had not seen these. They had some beautiful, beautiful homes, historic homes on Green Avenue. If you go to Orange and you go down Green Avenue now, most of them have been torn down. The one on the top was built by J.W. Link in 1904 and later became the home of the Edgar Brown family, and is right next to was right next to the First Presbyterian Church, which if you go to Orange, you have to see the church. It is the most beautiful jewel of a building you have ever entered. Below that is the Farwell home on Green Avenue. And one thing about Green Avenue, at one point in the 1920s, there were more millionaires per capita in Orange, Texas than any place in the United States. And so the homes that they had were just absolutely incredible, all types of architecture. I remember the Falwell home because as a little girl, they turned it into the Little Mexico restaurant, and I thought that was the coolest place in town to go eat. It's now the parking lot for the Stark Museum. The next slide. That was my grandfather's dorm room. I guess dorm room is probably not quite true. He probably had a suite. And it had pennants and a piano and a lamp, and he had another room where he had a bed, and this was at the University of Texas. He was the first student at the University of Texas to have a car. He was probably one of probably there were faculty members who didn't have a car. It was back in 1906. And he also is credited with naming the Texas Longhorns. He was chairman of the Board of Regents and on the Board of Regents for 24 years, longer than anyone before or since. And he led the drive to build Memorial Stadium in Austin. So he had a lot of Texas connections. The picture at the bottom is taken in 1929 at the Letcher and Moore office building, which is located right on the Sabine River. It's hurricane-proof so far. It's been there since 1915. And it is supposedly haunted, which also doesn't surprise me. This was a birthday party for W.H. Stark, and I just thought it was interesting that they're all men, and they had that crescent moon and star, which is kind of an interesting logo to have. The next This is my grandfather and his first wife, Nita, and my dad, Homer, and his twin brother, Bill, up at the top picture. What I found interesting, and of course you all know this from going through old photographs, is nobody smiled in the old photographs because so they look sad, but they're not sad. They're just posing because it took much longer for that snap of a camera. And I just included some pictures of my dad and uncle as little boys because people don't even know they exist sometimes in Orange because there is no mention of them anywhere. This is the Roslyn Ranch in Colorado, which is near Grand Lake or Rand, Colorado, if you're up in that area. It abuts up to the Joe Rout National Forest, and it was about 1,100 acres, had a lake, which was built in 1937, which you'll see my father fishing in on the bottom left-hand corner. And then that's my dad's horse, Pal. And this was a place where they would go in June and stay till, my grandfather and his first wife would stay until August. They'd send the boys back home to go to school, but they stayed until August. It's a beautiful place. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. The next is, one of the things that my grandfather and his first wife did was sponsor an organization called the Bengal Guards. And that was a drum and bugle corps in Orange, and they had very strict requirements. You had to make your grades, you had to attend school, you couldn't get in trouble. You took castor oil pills. You had to perform at, my grandfather even built a huge tower, like you'd see a football coach watching the team practice. He built a tower to watch the girls practice every day. And his own crew mowed the grass at the stadium every day. He didn't leave anything to chance. But the Bengal Guards were world-renowned. The interesting things about these three photographs, the top one has a picture of, it's in the school gymnasium, and has a picture by Herbert Dutton, who is a famous artist. And I thought it was strange, it was hanging in the high school gym, but apparently he put most of his art collection alternated in the gyms in the school. I don't think you do that today. The second photograph, the middle one, is some of the drum majors, the different levels of drum major, junior, senior, whatever, in their Western uniforms, which I found interesting because it has a Longhorn logo, which predates the one that is used by the University of Texas today and was drawn by Anita Hill Stark while she watched them practice one day. And the bottom photograph, that is at Soldier Field in Chicago. And the Bengal Guards performed before 80,000 people 2 years in a row. And they did not compete in the contest because it would not have been a contest. So they were the featured attraction. So he gave these women the opportunity to travel all over the United States, the Sugar Bowl, Chicago. They performed for Eleanor Roosevelt, the Attorney General of Texas, the governor, different dignitaries. And they still, to this day, just when you talk about my grandfather, it better be something nice because these women absolutely adore him. The next one, this is my mom and dad on the bottom, Homer Stark, and then this picture of them on the bottom right, and then my uncle, Bill, and my aunt, Ida Marie, up at the top. And I particularly picked the pictures with them in their uniform because they both enlisted right after Pearl Harbor and fought in World War II and returned in late 1945. And to my knowledge, they're the only Starks since John Thomas Stark who actually fought for their country. The next one would be, there's Sunset Grove Country Club, and there's a mention of that in the book, so you'll have something to allude to. And then that's just a photograph of my dad and uncle playing billiards or pool in their home with my grandfather. And then that's my mom. She's pretty good looking, wasn't she? She was the first girl to lead the University of Texas band. And I remember reading a news clipping that a reporter said that he was waiting to interview her, and he was watching her interact with her director, and he said the only thing he could think to ask her was for her phone number. And then the next one, this is at the top, shows my grandfather with what was considered a good day's hunt, and that was back before you had limits or anything like that. And then the little picture to the right shows Orange where they dredged the Sabine River so the ships didn't have to go around the curve. So that island is actually in Louisiana. That is Louisiana, and the top to the left part is orange, and the bottom right is Louisiana. And then this portion right here, all the white is some land that my grandfather bought in the 1920s, I think 1923, when he was married to Miss Nita. But it kind of disappeared from the books after she died. The next one and the last one is, this shows some pictures of downtown Orange, and if you go to downtown Orange now, there's hardly anything there other than the museum and the foundation offices and the theater and the library and a lot of empty space. The second picture shows an opera house and the Holland Hotel, which were absolutely gorgeous, and you would never expect to find all of this in a tiny little town in southeast Texas. And then that shows my grandfather driving this little electric car he had, or I think it was electric, and he named his garden area in Orange Shangri-La. And I think the license plate says Lost Horizon, which was kind of what happened to him later in his life. But those pictures are in there, and what I'd like to do is just briefly give you a little bit of background on why I wrote the book, or how I even started it in the first place. And these are there are like 4 questions people ask me all the time the last few months. One is like, why did I write it? And basically because I was bored. And in 1996, I was visiting Orange a lot on the weekends because my dad had been ill. And I started thinking, I'd seen Gunsmoke about as much as I could handle. And I thought, well, there are all these boxes I'd heard about that had been produced in a lawsuit several years earlier. And there were 400,000 documents sitting in a storage unit. So my cousins took me out there, and I started going through the boxes. We had been told it was mostly family stuff. And I thought, well, I'd like to know more about our family. And I went out there and brought the boxes home. And from the very first box, I was hooked. Because I thought, I didn't know that, or I didn't know this. And I'd go in and ask my dad a question, or my mom, or somebody else, and one thing would lead to another. And so I started going through those and discovered a lot of things about our family history that I didn't have any idea. And when I finally made a trip to Jamestown, Virginia, I decided we probably needed to write a book about the family history. And originally I was going to have someone else write it. But after my friend that I talked to talked to me for 3 hours, because I am a talker, he said, you have to write it because there are too many connections, there's too much information there. So then I moved to how do you go about researching a book, especially something like this. And the basic reply would be that just one thing led to another. And the realistic answer is that I tend to ask a lot of questions, and I followed where they took me. Some led back to where I'd already been, because I would learn that documents I had reviewed earlier didn't mean anything to me, but then I'd find something hidden away somewhere else, and I think, well, that's not what that said, or this looks a little suspicious to me. And so I would go back and forth looking at items with new information. And documents that didn't seem relative at first glance became very important later on when you compared them to something else. I visited courthouses in Louisiana and Texas, and university libraries in Austin, Denton, and Nacogdoches, and I interviewed some of the sweetest people in the world in Texas and Arkansas, Tennessee, Arizona, and Louisiana. And one sweet little man, when I asked him what he thought about Nelda, he said, if the devil had a wife, she would be it. And I thought, that's gotta be the title. And my dad argued with me for years. He said, oh no, it makes it seem like my dad's the devil. I said, no, Daddy, if, the if is in there. Although I can't say my grandfather comes out of this looking like a rose, but if you're drugged, you do things that you don't normally do. And some research would be just making a phone call, to confirm something or visit with someone and find out. The one thing I did find important for me to see with my very own eyes was my grandmother, Nelda, had been a nurse. All my life, I was told she had a nurse. Every press release, she was a nurse. And I couldn't remember. I thought she had told me one time she'd studied education. And so I drove to Denton, and I went to the university library, And I looked at the graduation program and the yearbook and other documents, and she clearly got a degree in education. So I couldn't understand why she always had that little black medical bag with her and she was taking care of people. Taking care of people has a different connotation in my world. If somebody says they'll take care of me, I'm going, oh, I hope so. I see you two in the back. Another question people would ask me is, why did you self-publish? Well, the main reason I self-published was because when you self-publish, you have control of the content and the title. And if I'd even attempted to go through a prominent or well-known or national or regional publisher, they can edit it any way they like, and you lose control. And it was very important to me that this be our story and that no one was going to change it except somebody in the family or someone who had a different opinion. And I had different people review it. Some people who didn't know us, didn't know anything about Orange, some people who knew a lot about Orange, some who knew a little bit about Orange. So I was very, very focused on doing the self-publishing angle. It also allowed me to invest in a website and a video trailer, which makes it look a little more professional. It's not like I just been operating out of my dining room and my house looks like a hand grenade, you know, exploded and documents are everywhere. But it gave me the opportunity to save some money and make sure this came out in a way that my dad and my mom would be pleased. And I wish they'd lived to see it. And I think they're upstairs thinking, man, there's sure a lot going on in Orange, Texas today. There are people talking about that book. The self-publishing route also, though, gives you the opportunity to, well, they distribute it through Amazon and they print it. So I can order from them and send it somewhere else, which has been really kind of nice. And as far as what took me so long, because it did take me 13 years, but I was working and I had children and grandchildren to take care of during the time. So I spent a lot of weekends and evenings working on the book, thinking about the book, talking about the book, interviewing people. And I think for nonfiction, especially a book like this, it is critically important that what you say is the truth or your opinion. Because I did talk to a lawyer before, you know, I got too deep into this, and they said that if it's the truth or your opinion, you're protected by the First Amendment. May not be someone else's opinion, but a lot of that is backed up by documentation that is now stored safely somewhere in the United States of America. And there are 149 boxes of various sizes that have about 450,000 pages in there. And when you read the last chapter, you'll know who has access to them. As well as I do too. But let me just look at my notes real quickly. But I would like to say in closing that whatever happens with the book, and I'm so pleased people seem to enjoy it and find it not quite so boring as most nonfiction books can sometimes be, that it has brought amazingly, and just in the last few weeks since it came out, closure to my entire family, to grandchildren of my cousins that I never knew, you know, I never had ever talked to before, are emailing me and calling me and talking and saying, we are so glad you wrote that book. We didn't know our family history. Even my cousin Bill was crying when he called me and he said, I never knew that. You know, I didn't know this. And I think it's so important when you go back and look at your family history that you really do, even if there's some things that you're not particularly proud of, that you put it all out there, because the people in your family who you really want to make them aware of where they came from, I think it's critically important to them. And I love my grandfather. I think he did some really kind of strange things along the way, but I understand a little bit more about why he did it and why he didn't have a choice in some cases. But most of all, I'm glad my parents were Homer and Becky Stark. And I'd be happy to take any questions.